My name is Mark Donadue, and I worked as a mechanical engineer for over 25 years, and I have a number of patents to my name. But I retired from that profession in 2012 to focus on my real passion, which was promoting a plant-based diet. And through a lot of the talks that I was doing, I also had organised World Vegan Day since 2003, which was in the end the largest vegan festival in the world, attracting over 25,000 people. And I was also president of Vegetarian Victoria from 2007 all the way up to the present day. And in that time, we produced that booklet that you mentioned called Eating Up the World. We have two versions of that, the environmental version and the health version. And tonight I'll be covering information from the health booklet and talking about all aspects of health and clarifying a lot of the myths that we have. Okay, so I thought we will just start right now and talk about the 10 top aspects of health that are largely neglected or misunderstood. And the first one of those is inflammation. Now, you'll see here that I have said that inflammation is at the root of most diseases. And in fact, if you have a look at this following slide here, you can see that inflammation is responsible or at the root of cancer, cardiovascular diseases, neurological diseases, Alzheimer's, diabetes, arthritis, so many of these major illnesses. And we have a slide here that actually talks about white blood cell count and how that is linked with systematic inflammation. So in other words, the more white blood cells you have, the more systematic inflammation you have. And this study here actually shows that the white blood cell count is a very good predictor of things like cardiovascular disease, according to these studies here. And it also shows that the white blood cell count can also be considered a general biomarker of exposure to oxidant-generating stimuli. For example, smoking is one of the biggest causes of oxidants. And then you can see that it raises your white blood cell count or the leukocytes quite dramatically. And then when we have a look at different diets, you'll see that diets also can play a role in generating more white blood cells. If you're on a non-vegetarian diet, you produce quite a lot of white blood cells because there are a lot of toxins, like endotoxins, in the meat and dairy products and eggs and as well as meat, fish, and dairy products. And you tend to find that they create a huge amount of pathogens. To give you an indication, if you take a bowl of salad or a bowl of soup, you have something like about 100 pathogens or harmful bacteria. You look at an average steak, you have something like 500,000 harmful bacteria there. Same with even an egg or a bottle of milk. And so the more plant-based you are, the lower the production of white blood cells. And white blood cells are effectively like the cleanup crew to clean up a lot of debris that shouldn't be in the blood. People think of them as like an army that's attacking an invader, but it's actually like a rubbish removal crew removing a lot of toxins. And so the lower the white blood cells, the better. Now, there was a study that was done a few years ago where they put people on what was called the Daniel fast, which is based on the story of Daniel in the Old Testament, where he was on a totally plant-based diet. And then King Nebuchadnezzar was impressed by Daniel and his friends, and they proved to be smarter and healthier than all the others, that they were looking at, and so they made Daniel a chief advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar. Anyway, so based on that is a diet called the Daniel diet and the Daniel fast, and which is basically devoid of any animal products, preservatives, and very inclusive of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. What they found when they put people on that diet is that the white blood cell count dropped quite dramatically from 5.7 down to 5, whereas the control group, there wasn't any change, and so that shows the wonderful effect that being on a totally plant-based diet has. Now have a look at this. When it comes to things like arthritis, which we know are a very inflammatory disease, you'll see there that the control group, had quite a high white blood cell count, and the people who were on the plant-based diet had a dramatically lower white blood cell count, and their arthritis improved dramatically as well. We know that smokers certainly generate a lot of oxidants, and as a result, produce a lot of inflammation and a huge white blood cell count. But interestingly, according to this study here, it actually shows that a whole foods vegan diet was more effective in reducing white blood cell count than smoking a packet a day for 28 years. Can you believe that? That shows you the effect that switching to a plant-based diet can have in improving your white blood cell count. Now, let's say a person had a burger, and which I think is a very bad thing to do, and then they measure the levels of inflammatory markers like interleukin-6, and you can see there after 3 to 4 hours that there's a big spike in the inflammatory marker interleukin-6. Now, just by adding avocado to that meal, was able to blunt that spike quite dramatically. Why? Because avocado, being a very healthy fat, even though people think, oh, I'm going to avoid an avocado, it's 70% fat, but it's actually good fats, unlike animal fats that are creating inflammation and increasing your white blood cell count. The avocados actually reduce that. What they do is they reduce inflammation, they absorb acids, and very high in fiber, and they pull acids and toxins out of your bloodstream and actually lower your inflammation. So avocados are particularly beneficial for that. In fact, interestingly, a man who ran across America in 11 days, breaking all world records, running 3 marathons a day, running 21 hours out of 24, he was living on avocados and wheatgrass and barley grass, and he was not breaking down like all the other athletes, tearing ligaments and tearing muscles, because the avocado was reducing the inflammation, reducing the acidity that so many athletes suffer with when they're doing ultra marathon running. So the avocado, alone can provide huge benefits. Now, depression has also been linked to inflammation. In fact, there are studies that actually show that major depressive disorder is largely linked with increased inflammatory markers. And then they find that the more the inflammation, the more the mental illness. And they find there that by adding some of these inflammatory proteins, they notice a huge jump in major depression, including depressed mood, feelings of worthlessness, guilt, and suicidal tendencies, and so forth. So inflammation, again, is largely responsible for that. Vaccines that contain live viruses also have a lot of toxins that can cause depression, as you can see from these studies here. We have also a study of 43,000 women where they looked at the foods they ate and the depression that they had and the inflammation they had. And they found there was a massive correlation between the inflammatory diet pattern and the depression. And in fact, they said that the inflammatory dietary pattern is associated with a higher depressive risk. And it suggests a chronic inflammation may underline the association between diet and depression. Now, there's a lot of people going out there promoting fish, saying that it is high in omega-3s and it lowers inflammation. Well, in actual fact, it doesn't. And in fact, this study here actually shows that increased inflammation. This is from the famous NERSA study. And what people don't understand is that yes, there are omega-3s in fish, but they turn rancid as soon as the fish is killed. In fact, when you go past a fish shop, that terrible rancid smell, the fish smell, is the omega-3s going rancid, going off. When they become rancid, they switch from being anti-inflammatory to being pro-inflammatory. Plus, you have all these heavy metals and flame retardants and PCBs, dioxins, and all sorts of other microplastics, all these nasty things in the fish, which also increase the inflammation as well. So it's far from being a healthy food, it's actually a very unhealthy food, as a lot of these studies are now showing. When you switch to a plant-based diet, you can see that you have a very anti-inflammatory effect due to the antioxidants. And in this case, they're measuring one of the inflammatory markers, which is C-reactive protein. And you can see how it's dramatically dropped by switching to a plant-based diet. And here you can see that when you have a whole lot of saturated fats, you tend to have increased inflammation. And why? Because endotoxins, which is a very, very inflammatory substance that's in meat, that's what they actually use to increase inflammation on laboratory rats. They give them endotoxin from meat, and then they watch their inflammation go up. And so, yes, animal fat is loaded in these toxins which are inflammatory. And here's an interesting study where they actually compared 4 different things they had on inflammation. Here they were looking at changes in endotoxin concentration, and the endotoxins correlated with inflammation. And you can see there when they had orange juice, there no change. Glucose, which people think are very inflammatory, yeah, a little bit of a change, hardly anything. Water, no change. But as soon as they introduce cream, which is from dairy and we know is loaded in fat, have a look at the inflammation, just go through the roof, and the endotoxins go rise very, very dramatic, especially between that the period from 0 to 3 hours. It rose very, very dramatically. So again, these animal products are very, very high in endotoxins and create inflammation. And as this study actually says, the obvious solution to metabolic endotoxemia appears to be to reduce saturated fat intake. The Western diet is not conducive to this mode of action, and it is difficult for patients to comply with this request. And that's been one of the problems, trying to get people to actually switch to a plant-based diet. But when they do, they find that things like inflammation improve dramatically, and so many other diseases that are linked to inflammation also improve. We just talked about arthritis, heart disease, diabetes, cancers. All of these things improve dramatically when you remove these inflammatory markers and all these endotoxins and other poisons, that are in the animal food. Have a look at this study here. Here they looked at interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory marker, and you can see how it rises as they gave people endotoxins. Now, what also increased at the same time was also another inflammatory marker, which was necrosis factor alpha. And so both of those inflammatory markers went up. But have a look at down the bottom. The social disconnection went up, and so did depression. So as soon as the inflammation went into the bloodstream, so did the social disconnection go up, and so did the depressed mood. Again, showing the link between depression and inflammation. Now here they're looking at brain responses in responses to a reward. So someone's playing a video game for money, for example, and when they win, they normally get a part of the brain that lights up, that makes them happy, that they've actually achieved something. That's called a positive brain response. But when people have got endotoxins or inflammation, they get a reduction in that. And that's quite noticeable, So that's also another marker of mental health, when your reward centers are actually being diminished through the inflammation. So now we're moved off inflammation, and we're now going to the next important aspect of health, point number 9. So we've gone from 10 to 9, and this one is talking all about the gut. And in fact, the gut has been described as the second brain, because you know that there are more neurotransmitters in the gut than there are in the brain. We have a nervous system, and we also have what's called a vagus nerve on both sides of the body, connecting the brain to the heart to the gut. And 90% of the information flows from the gut to the heart to the brain, and only 10% from the brain to the heart to the gut. And so the gut plays an incredible role. And in fact, gut microbiota composition correlates with the diet and health in the elderly. And they found that the better the diversity of healthy gut bacteria, the better health outcomes across the board, for these people. And we have something like 300 to 400 square meters in gastrointestinal system, which is something like the equivalent of about 2 tennis courts if you have to lay everything out, which shows you how much surface area our intestines actually take up. And according to these studies, for many years it was believed that the main function of the large intestine was the reabsorption of water and salt and facilitated the disposal of waste materials. However, now we've seen that it's actually much more important than that, that it's actually could be considered as a separate organ with a metabolic capacity, which is something like 100 times more than that of the liver. And people don't realize that it plays many roles. Yes, it actually detoxifies toxins, like the liver does and the kidney do, but it also produces a lot of neurotransmitters, which are important for our thinking. It also improves inflammation by producing a substance called butyrate, which is the most anti-inflammatory substance that we actually have studied or know about. And one of the ways that we improve the gut microbiome is through having more plant food, and dietary plant material commonly referred to as dietary fiber, is the most common fuel for the microbiome, or for the microbiota. And this is a slide showing that's been color enhanced, the different types of gut bacteria. You can see the rod forms of in blue, one type of bacteria, and then there's the circular types of gut bacteria as well. Then there are spore forms. So they're all different types, and all of them play an important role in breaking down the food and also producing these anti-inflammatory substances and so much more. Now, this is like a little cartoon which shows you the difference between what they call good bacteria and bad bacteria. But in actual fact, I think that that's inaccurate to say that, because all bacteria play a role. It's just that the bad bacteria are associated with a disease condition. So if you're eating a lot of these meats and dairy products that have a lot of endotoxins and that have created a lot of acids, they tend to damage a lot of healthy tissue. And then as a result of that, what you tend to find is that you need a greater variety of stronger bacteria to break down that diseased tissue. And so we call them the bad bacteria, because they're usually associated with ill health, whereas the bacteria associated with good health, such as those on the left, like Acidophilus and Casei and Thermophilus, etc., Bifidium, they're associated with good health outcomes, because they're just breaking down healthy food and putting nutrients into the bloodstream. And so, but all the bacteria all play a role. And in fact, the microbiome it does many things, and one of them is it creates waste that goes out, sent to the liver in the form of solid waste, and 55% of that mass is actually bacteria. And so, the quality of bacteria determines, your health enormously. And here they've actually done a study looking at the effect of legumes or beans and their kernel fibers and citrus fiber on the risk factors for colorectal cancer. And what they actually found is that the more of these that you had, the less colon problems and colorectal cancer that people had. And in fact, the evidence actually showed that the microorganisms inhibiting our body, known as the microbiome, have a greater role than the human genome variation or the pathogenesis or the formation of harmful substances of obesity, given the direct interaction with environmental factors. So basically what it's basically saying is our human gut biome determines whether we're going to be fat or not, whether we're going to be healthy or not. It's a predeterminant for so many things. And this study also showed that an increased consumption of fruits and vegetables and hence a higher fiber diet seemed to be associated with a huge variety of healthy gut bacteria. And a healthy person needs somewhere between 20,000 to 40,000 healthy gut bacteria. And the more of that diversity, the less cancers you have, the less allergies you have, the less diseases you have. In fact, people that say nut intolerant or say peanut intolerant are missing one type of healthy gut bacteria. People that have got hay fever are missing certain healthy gut bacteria. People that are allergic to fructose, again, have certain bacteria that they're missing. And then there's people that are allergic to or have problems with oxalates. Again, that's another sign of having healthy gut bacteria that are missing. And that's why antibiotics are such a bad thing. And in fact, there's nothing more destructive to our gut biome than antibiotics. And yet people take them liberally. So as soon as anyone gets a cold or flu and they go to the doctor, the first thing they do is they give them antibiotics, which is insane, because you need those healthy gut bacteria. And the cold and flu is nothing more than mucus coming out of you and fever being raised to actually excrete toxins out at high temperature so the body can cleanse itself. It's not something to be stopped or to be attacked. It just let nature take its course, not take harmful antibiotics. In fact, one round of antibiotics in a 12-month period has been associated with a 14% increase in depression, and 2 rounds of antibiotics within the same 12 months showed an increase of depression by 54%. So you can see the destructive nature of having antibiotics. Now, a number of studies have been associated with increased micro richness and generally the diets with higher fruits and vegetables and fiber are those that give you the greater diversity of healthy gut bacteria. Now, grains have been largely attacked in the media and certain articles, as being cause of problems. But really, grains are only a problem when they're sprayed with huge amounts of pesticides. In fact, in this country, we have a process called desiccation of wheat, where they use 100 times the amount of Monsanto's Roundup on the wheat to kill it intentionally. Why would you use so much pesticide on a plant to kill it? Because when you kill the wheat, it goes to seed and to pass its seeds on to an unpoisoned area to keep the species going. And they exploit that fact by getting an early harvest, because here it's the seed that you're harvesting. So there's no green patches to work around. Everything's dead and dry. So it's really easy to harvest. But a lot of studies are showing that it's actually responsible for most of the celiac disease, wheat intolerance, gluten intolerance, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, and intestinal deaths. And whereas gluten is not. In fact, that's why when people go to European Union and they have some bread or pasta, people that are celiac and gluten intolerant, they can eat those without a problem. That's why when people eat organic bread, they don't seem to have a problem, even though they're celiac. It's because it's the Roundup in huge concentrations that they're actually allergic to in most of their cases. And this is a little chart that basically shows you the difference between prebiotics and probiotics. And you can see that really prebiotics are the best way for us to increase our gut bacteria by eating just healthy plant foods. And, they've compared people on gluten-free diets with people on a healthy gluten diet, but an organic one, or one without these huge pesticides. And they find that there's a greater variety of gut bacteria when you have even things like whole grain barley and brown rice. And when you have them together, you have a greater increase in healthy gut bacteria than if you had one or the other by themselves. Because they increase the huge amounts of richness of healthy gut bacteria. And when they look at prebiotics, resistant starches and fibers, they don't increase the bacterial diversity, but having these plant foods certainly does. And in fact, it says here that this study provided evidence that a short-term increased intake of whole grains led to the compositional alterations of the gut microbiota that coincided with improvements in systematic inflammation. Yeah, because they help improve some of the anti-inflammatory substances like butyrate, which are incredibly anti-inflammatory. And here it shows that whole grains were associated with lower body mass index and less overweight conditions. And one of the best and effective ways to deal with long-term weight gain and to offset that and to reverse that. And whole grains have many healthy components that are rich in starch, healthy fats, antioxidant nutrients, minerals, lignans, phenolic compounds, etc., and have been shown to reduce, coronary heart disease, cancers, diabetes mellitus, obesity, and other chronic diseases. Again, it shows that this setup shows a scenario where individuals on a gluten-free diet were more susceptible to overgrowth of harmful bacteria and infections. Now that's a shock to a lot of people because they think that they're doing the right thing just by going gluten-free. But what they've actually found is that there are naturally occurring fructose type resistant starches in wheat, such as oligofructose and inulin, that are beneficial for creating a healthy composition of healthy gut bacteria. And they protect the gut from cancers, inflammatory conditions, cardiovascular disease. Gluten also can boost the immune system in humans, but it's providing that it's not sprayed with huge amounts of Roundup, and then it is a benefit. And increased gluten was associated with a 13% reduction in triglycerides, or fats in the blood. And in many cases, gluten intolerance has been mistaken for Roundup intolerance. In fact, here on this study, glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, it shows that it pathways to modern diseases, celiac, sprue, and gluten intolerance. And highlighted there was glyphosate, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, is the most important causal factor in this epidemic. In fact, they went on to show that about 95% to 99% of those celiac diseases were associated with these heavy spraying of glyphosate or Roundup on the wheat. And in fact, here, as you can see, this chart shows that as the glyphosate on wheat has increased rapidly, so has the incidence of celiac disease. It's gone up with such a tight correlation. And here, the deaths due to intestinal infections have also increased as the glyphosate on wheat has increased as well. So that's the thing to watch out for. And it shows that glyphosate suppression of the P450 enzymes and amino acids will lead to so many diseases, and including inflammatory bowel disease, obesity, depression, ADHD, autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, multiple sclerosis, cancer. It goes on and on. Now, what about other things? You know, like for example, what about oats? Well, guess what? Australia are now doing the desiccation of oats. In fact, we know that this is a problem because there was a shipment of Australian oats sent to Taiwan, and the Taiwanese government banned it because it exceeded their levels of Roundup. And the Australian Oat Board at the time was trying to say, oh, well, that's a rare thing that normally doesn't happen. Then they did an independent study and they found that all the non-organic oats were affected like this, and it was causing major problems. That's why when people switch to organic oats, their bloating goes away, and they think, "Wow, I thought it was it was gluten, or they thought it was that just oats were causing a problem." No, it was the Roundup on the oats that was causing the problem. And here the conclusion is people on a gluten-free diet had significantly higher urine levels of total arsenic and blood levels of mercury, lead, and cadmium than persons that were not, avoiding gluten. And why? Because a lot of the gluten-free rice, for example, sometimes some of these products that they use that come from places like Bangladesh, and some cases where farmers are given free fertilizer mixed with heavy metals and toxins that they had to pay millions of dollars to dispose. They mix it with the fertilizer, and so they poison all these areas. Rice also is a sequester of a lot of these heavy metals, and if you grow rice on polluted ground, we're talking non-organic here, they can draw out a lot of these toxins like cadmium, lead, and mercury. So you have to be careful. If you're going to have gluten-free, it must be organic. But you'll find that a lot of people who previously thought they were gluten intolerant can actually do well on organic products with gluten. And out of the 4,000 participants, 32% participants adhering to a strict gluten-free diet had twice as much arsenic in their urine and 70% more mercury in their blood than those eating a standard diet. Now, we'll move on to the next point, which is whole foods versus processed foods. And there's a guy here called Jeff Novak that talks about this, trying to avoid processed foods and how that they're at the root of so many digestive problems that people have. You're eating stuff that's deprived of nutrients, and that just raises your blood sugar levels and doesn't really provide you what the body needs. Doesn't provide fiber, doesn't provide nutrient. And in fact, if you have a look here, you tend to find a high fiber diet is one of the best ways to make sure that you have a lower plasma insulin, compared to a standard diet. Now, you know that one of the longest living people in the world are the Okinawas, and 70% of their diet is sweet potato. And so when you have a look at that's very high in fiber, it's very high in nutrients, and yet they don't have diabetes, like we have here in the West. And in fact, the more processing that you have, the higher the glycemic index, the more processed the food, the more it shoots up your blood sugar index. The greater the processed food, the glycemic load goes up. And you look at certain foods like white rice, yes, it's got 66% less fiber. White flour, 75% less fiber. But animal foods, they're 100% less fiber. They don't have any fiber at all. And that's why animal foods are actually one of the worst things from that perspective, because you need fiber and animal foods don't have that. And all they do is they clog you up and actually lead to problems where you have sulfur-based amino acids being released and creating acidity and other issues. And in fact, when we look at food addiction, that usually comes about with processed food. As that study showed, processed foods are manufactured using methods similar to those of addictive drugs, including distillation, crystallization, concentration, and extraction, where processed foods are no longer natural. And that goes on more. Similar patterns of neural activation are implicated in addictive-like eating behaviors and substance dependence, elevated activation in reward circuitry in response to food cues. And that's what happens when you have, a lot of these processed foods. And you can see there that it affects the brain in negative ways. Again, there's more you know, studies that show that it restricts blood flow to the brain, does all of these things. In fact, they looked at you know, processed foods, and they found that highly processed foods appeared to be the most implicated in loss of controlled eating. In contrast, the majority of minimally processed foods, such as fruits and vegetables, were least related. However, several minimally processed foods that may contain added sodium, cheese, bacon, were clustered with highly processed foods. Okay, now we have another study here with body size and fatness of free-living baboons. Now, these were baboons that were near a dump where there was a tourist lodge, and those baboons put on a lot of weight. Why? Because as there was a book that was actually, it was called You're Not Fat, You're Toxic. The more toxins you have, the more fat cells that you produce, and so the fatter you become. In fact, that's one of the reasons, you know, why they give fish meal to chickens, because the heavy metals concentrated in the fish meal provide so many toxins that the fish has to metabolize. Then they give them antibiotics to fatten them up because it kills the healthy gut bacteria. So the chickens become fat so rapidly. So instead of waiting 12 weeks to harvest the chicken, they can harvest the chicken in 6 weeks because it's got so fat so fast. And the people eating the chicken are also going to be sick as well, you know, as a result of that. And here we have with looking at paleo diets, and have a look at the amount of fiber in the paleo diet, looking at the Paleolithic human beings compared to the modern diet. This is looking at fossilized poop and looking at the contents of intestines of Paleolithic people, and they had way more nutrients in their diet. And the fiber basically indicates that they were mostly plant eaters. And in fact, that's what most of the evidence actually shows when they looked at Paleolithic human beings Neanderthal man, and looked at that. They all find plant foods in their teeth and on the tools. They never find meat. And so this idea that we had evolved, you know, by eating meat, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for it. The evidence actually shows we're mostly plant eaters. Now, fiber supplementation with psyllium does not replicate the results seen in a diet naturally high in fiber. And this actually shows that according to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, the number one nutrient that people were deficient in is fiber, and was responsible for just about all of the illnesses that we have, a lack of fiber. And they actually define it as a nutrient, because people previously thought that fiber was just something that cleans out your intestines and doesn't do much else. But no, it actually provides nutrient for the gut bacteria, and as well as pulling toxins out, as well as doing so many other things, reducing inflammation. Now, this shows you what happens when you have a processed food like Wonder Bread, that your blood glucose levels go through the roof. Most people are not surprised. But you take the same Wonder Bread and you put almond spread on there, it actually blunts the blood sugar levels, because the almonds have got fiber, and they reduce that uptake of glucose. Have a look at this. Here we also have the serum insulin levels also are improved when you have almonds as well. Now we'll move on to the next point here, which is longevity and well-being. And there was a thing called a study called the Blue Zones, where they looked at the long-living people and what they ate, and they found that eat less and live long, healthy life. Study shows it's not in all cases, and the Blue Zones actually showed it's what you eat that's more important. And one of the common denominators of the people in the Blue Zones was that there was a plant-heavy diet right in the center of that those three circles. And yeah, sure, yeah, they're also big bean eaters as well. Yes, they had social engagement. They tend to have close-knit communities. They had moderate physical activity, no smoking, and they were very family-orientated. But the plant-based diet, or the heavy emphasis on eating mostly plants, was huge in that. In fact, one of those was the Okinawan's, one of the Blue Zones. There was also those in Nevada and Sardinia, and the Seven-Day Adventists in Loma Linda, California. They were the three main ones. And you know, most people think that the Okinawans eat a lot of fish. No, 99% of their diet was plant-based, as this study shows. And in fact, one of the documentaries on the Okinawans actually said, "Don't you get sick of just eating plants all day?" You know, that was the one of the famous sort of take-home quotes. And this shows you that sweet potatoes were 70% of their diet. and meat and fish was less than 1% of their diet. So basically plant eaters. And it's interesting that they measured one of the main free radical byproducts called lipid peroxide, and the centenarians level of 1.67 nanomoles per milliliter was significantly lower than people that were 70-year-old average people, that were not in Okinawa, whose level was 3.4. So this is compelling evidence that they suffered less free radical damage. Yeah, because your diet's mostly plant-based. And in fact, the Japanese individuals have been described as the longest living population, but they don't survive as long as the 7-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California. And there, what's interesting is that the non-smoking, non-drinking, vegan 7-day Adventists outlive, say, Mormons who are a similar religion in California, in the same area, breathing the same air. They outlive them by over 10 years. In fact, the Mormons lived to 74 years of age, and here you are, looking at longevities of 87 and 89 for the 7-day Adventists. So you can see the effect of a plant-based diet, what it actually has. Most people think that as you get older, your blood pressure gets worse or increases. Well, have a look at this. In Kenya, where most of the marathon runners actually come from, they find that as they get older, their blood pressure improves. Now, the main difference is that they're on a plant-based diet, largely plant-based diet, compared to the average Western diet, which is a meat and animal product-centered diet, where the blood pressure does get worse, but not in the countries eating mostly plant-based. Now, as we get older, we tend to age, and a lot of the aging has been linked to inflammation. In fact, there's a term that's been coined called inflammaging, where they look at, in this case, interleukin 6, and you can see that increasing, and you can see there that that is a result of aging. And inflammaging is defined as chronic low-grade inflammation. Typical of aging, seems to be a common biological factor responsible for the decline and onset of disease in the elderly. And a key successful aging and longevity is to decrease chronic inflammation without compromising acute response when exposed to pathogens. And so nutrition is important there for people. Now, the biomarkers of inflammation were always meat-based or Western patterns, while vegetable and fruit-based or healthy patterns tend to be inversely associated with inflammation, which is what we've been saying, all the way through here. And obesity is also linked with many cancers and inflammation again, and the very same foods are implicated again. So obesity-associated inflammation is one of the risk factors when it comes to cancer. Okay, what about influenza? Well, every year we have thousands of Australians that end up affected by influenza, and we have certain numbers of that end up dying of complications from that. And most of them tend to be the very elderly, as you can see from this graph. But this study actually shows just by giving them broccoli sprouts, homogenates, they found that the inflammation markers dramatically dropped, and so did all of the negative effects that they normally associate with colds and flu. A lot of those problems tend to go away quite dramatically. And here it actually showed that the preventative therapeutic potential of broccoli and broccoli sprouts, rich in glucoraphanin, for reducing the impact of particulate pollution on allergic disease and asthma. So it even helps with that. And broccoli sprouts are one of the healthiest foods you can eat. They're an example of a plant-based food, rich in all of these nutrients. And when you look at dietary fat intake recommendations, ALA, which is alpha linoleic acid, which is found in green leaves and seeds like flax seeds, is one of the healthiest fats that you can possibly eat. And in fact, this chart shows you how when you eat plant-based alpha linoleic acid, say from flax seeds, it then uses an enzyme to convert ALA into EPA, which is eicosapentaenoic acid. Then it adds another 2 carbons to the chain to create DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. So the body produces that naturally. Now, the mistake a lot of people make is they think, oh, I need to eat EPA and DHA from fish. No. When you do that, you have an excess of that because the body can't metabolize it, being plant-based beings that we are, we can't get rid of excess EPA or DHA, and then that becomes rancid in the body, can lead to cancers. So we have a natural cycle where we produce all of those. So there's no need to be looking for things like fish, to be getting EPA and DHA. Even eating algae is probably not such a great idea too, because you get a lot of these blue-green algae toxins, and you get an excess of EPA and DHA. So I wouldn't even do that. Just eat the regular plant-based foods, and you'll get adequate the essential fatty acids without having to do anything extraordinary. Now, have a look at this. This is a guy here called Ellsworth Wareham, and he was 100 here, and he retired at 95. So what's his story? Well, the council asked him to build a fence around his property, and when he was 93, and because it was going to cost him $10,000, and he thought, no, I can build it myself, and I can save that money. So for 3 days, he was digging holes, pouring concrete, nailing. But a few days later, he was found where they perform open heart surgery in his local hospital. So people thought, okay, maybe he was on a vegan diet his whole life. Maybe he thought he was Superman. Maybe he overdid it and ended up in hospital. No, he was a surgeon performing open heart surgery on someone a third his own age on a very different diet than him. Then he retired at the age of 95, much to the protest of his colleagues, because he had the steadiest hand. Can you imagine 95 having a steady hand? And he was the most experienced, obviously, surgeon. They didn't want him to retire, but he wanted to spend more time with his family, and he celebrated his 100th birthday. Now that is what retirement should look like. And there he was mowing his lawn, at 100. Now when people say, oh, I don't want to live to 100 because I don't want to be in a wheelchair, or I don't want to be in a nursing home. No, that's if you're at a standard Western diet and you do all of those horrible things like having alcohol and taking drugs and doing, not sleeping and not getting sunlight, not drinking healthy water. Yeah, you do all these bad things. Yeah, you're going to end up that way. But if you look after yourself, there's every chance you'll be like Ellsworth Wareham and be in great health and have a very, very healthy long life. Now we're moving to the section of alkaline foods. Now, alkaline foods are important, and I'll explain why. And typically, the plant-based foods are those that are alkaline, whereas the processed foods and animal-based foods are very acid-forming. When they looked at the kidney disease, for example, they found that there was a huge correlation between how alkaline you were and good, healthy kidneys, and how unhealthy people ate, and how acidic they were, and how their kidney function was suffering and had bad kidney function. And they actually found that, yes, our ancestors were more plant-based, as this study was showing, and had no problems with kidneys. And as we mentioned there before, with the Paleolithic diet. And the dietary acid load is determined by the balance of acid-inducing foods, which are rich in animal proteins, such as meats, eggs, and cheese, and base-inducing foods, which is rich in fruits and vegetables, such as raisins, apples, peaches, spinach, cauliflower, etc. And in fact, acid-inducing diets are believed to impact the kidney via tubular toxicity of elevated ammonium concentrations. And so you want to avoid that. The kidney is what we call a vascular organ, because it's got thousands of little blood vessels, which makes it red in color, but they can be damaged easily. And too much acid is at the root of that problem. And an important part of renal or kidney compensation for metabolic acidosis is the enhanced production and excretion of ammonia. And then it just talks about how that is leading to so many problems with kidneys. And so a more alkaline pH, leads to better kidney function, whereas animal foods, which are high in sulfur-based amino acids, cause a lot of problems to the kidney. And you can see here in this chart here, a lot of these alkaline foods tend to be the plant foods. Even a bowl of pasta is still alkaline there. You've got some of the fruits, and you've got broccoli, and you've got black beans. And whereas the acid form foods there, you can see the meat, the dairy, the eggs, the white bread, all of those things. And acid is a metabolism of organic sulfur rich in dietary protein, which promotes kidney damage. So there it is, the amino acids from meat and dairy and eggs, promote kidney damage. And in fact, when you alkalize by even adding sodium bicarbonate, for example, to the drinking water, you can see there that dramatically improved kidney function. It demonstrated that bicarbonate supplementation slows the rate of progression of renal failure and improves the nutritional status among people with chronic kidney disease, and improve their uptake of nutrients as well. Because why? Because it neutralizes acids that were interfering with that absorption of nutrients that were being used to buffer the acidity. And again, with the people with acidosis, were having more kidney disease, and those that were deficient in fruits and vegetables had the most kidney disease. Even the meat replacers that some vegetarians had were still nowhere near as acidic as what the meat eaters were having by having actual meat. And there's another chart there, basically showing the same sort of thing about the pH. When a low-fat meal and a high-fat meal, the high-fat meal had a very, very high pH. A very high acidity or low pH, and those that had low fat or high fiber had a very high pH and very low acidity. And now we're moving to the next point here, which is what's more effective for weight loss? Is it exercise or is it eating healthy? Well, have a look at this. When they looked at the body mass index in America, the only group that was in the healthy range was vegans. Even the vegetarians who consume dairy and eggs were a little bit over. The fish eaters a bit higher, the semi-veg people higher, and the meat eaters the highest again. And when you look at body mass index, you know, it's interesting when you compare endurance runners with people on a low protein, low calorie diet. The weight, the body mass index is virtually the same, whereas those on a standard Western diet tend to be, you know, a lot heavier. And here we are, the vegans there had a lower levels, you know, of these markers for health. You know, so they're doing far better than even the marathon runners, and certainly far better than the meat eaters. And they found a low-fat diet or strenuous exercise. That they looked at it, and they found that when you looked at the effect of diet and exercise on the blood, they actually found that the diet and exercise was far more effective than just exercise, and infinitely more, you know, healthier than the control group. And then again, you looked at triglyceride fat levels in the blood. The vegans certainly had the best outcomes by far. We talked about how blood pressure improves as you're more plant-based. Drinking water is important. 75% of our body is water, and it's something that people make a mistake to be dehydrated. It's responsible for so many problems that people have. What about tear function? You know, increased water consumption to 6 to 8 glasses a day alone improves the ability to produce tears and avoid dry eye, for example. Tear secretion decreases with progressive hydration. I mean, you think it's common sense. Also, decrease in saliva. You know, the more dehydrated you are. And here we have again that shows you that the more dehydrated, you know, the less you know, that you produce a lot of these fluids that you need, like saliva, like tears, and it causes all these issues. And there's more of it there, but basically it shows that, you know, we really need to be drinking at least 2 liters water a day for females and 2.5 for males. And a lot of people are not getting anywhere near that, unfortunately. And we're talking actual water, not fluids, you know, like juices, for example, which are treated as solids by the body, not as actual water. Vitamin D, we need sunlight. We need natural sunlight, not vitamin D tablets, which is the byproduct of sunlight. You know, and when you looked at outcomes for vitamin D, New Mexico and Arizona had the highest statewide mean solar values, and they experienced way less colon cancer compared to the areas that got the least sun, as you can see there. 6.7 as opposed to 17, compared to people in New York, New Hampshire, and Vermont that got very little sun. So the more sun you get, the less cancers you have. 15 types of cancer were inversely associated with ultraviolet, and from the book that we mentioned a little bit earlier, Eating Up the World, in the vitamin D section, it actually says in Australia, from October to March, 10 to 15 minutes of unprotected sun on the face and arms before 10 a.m. or after 3 p.m. is enough. 3 to 4 times a week provides enough vitamin D. In Melbourne and Hobart, from April to September, and Adelaide in June and July, you may need short periods of exposure in UV times like between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. to get enough vitamin D. And so that's basically what you need to do. You just need to get sun for about 15 minutes in the winter in the peak hours, and in the summer outside of those peak hours. Now we're coming to the next topic, which is milk. Is milk healthier or isn't it? Well, let's have a look at osteoporosis. We look at bones. Those on the right have got a lot of holes in them and has a lot of porosity. That's what we call osteoporosis. And whereas a normal bone tends to be denser. The more acidic we are, the more we lose the bone mass, because calcium is one of the alkaline buffers. And milk actually destroys the bones. In fact, in that book that I talked about, the one that I was involved in publishing, which is Eating Up the World, it actually shows the famous nurses study, Harvard nurses study, where they had two groups of nurses, those drinking 2 glasses of milk or more, and those not drinking any milk. Those not drinking any milk actually had far less hip fractures, far less bone fractures, hip replacements, and had stronger bone tensile strength than the group having 2 glasses of milk. The Bantu in Africa that consume 1/10 the dietary calcium that we do in the West have the strongest bones in the world. So clearly, dairy is not only not helping, it's actually making it worse. And this study actually showed greater milk consumption during childhood and adolescence contributes to peak bone mass and is therefore expected to avoid osteoporosis and bone fractures later in life. However, milk consumption during teen years was not associated with lower risk of hip fracture in older adults and our cohorts. Instead, a significant 9% increase was observed in men for each additional glass of milk consumed per the teenage years. And their findings suggested partial explanations for the long-standing enigma that hip fracture rates are highest in populations with the highest milk consumption. Have a look at this. This is the quote here from the study author Carl Mickelson at Uppsala University. I've looked at the fractures during the last 25 years. I've been puzzled by the question because there was again and again a tendency of higher risk fracture with higher intake of milk. And a higher milk intake was associated with one of the mechanisms, which is higher D-galactose. And experimental evidence shows that it's it's damaging to the health, and they found that in fact leads to bone loss. It leads to oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, neurodegeneration, damage of the brain cells, decreased immune response, and so forth. So that seemed to be the smoking gun in terms of one of the main problems with milk. It also has other sugars, not just D-galactose. It's got also lactose and 12 other sugars, all of which are acidic and actually lead to problems. And so the women that had the most dairy had the most higher rate of death, and milk consumption corresponding to 3 or more glasses of milk a day, compared with less than 1 glass a day, was associated with a hazard ratio of mortality 1.9. So double the risk of dying the more milk you have. So that's and certainly more hip fracture as it shows there. So it's something to avoid. And the final topic, just before we get to the question and answers, is iron. A lot of people think that you need to eat animal foods to get iron. The opposite's true. I know people that have been told that all their lives and been anemic all their lives, only to find that they became vegan later and then their iron levels improved straight away. Why? Because you actually get iron from plant sources, but your hemoglobin isn't being damaged by the acidity of the sulfur-based amino acids in meat and dairy and eggs, and so it actually retains your hemoglobin, so you don't lose so much iron. And but there's a ton of iron, like in spinach, for example, and collards and lentils and broccoli, and all of those have got more iron than what meat has. So you can see there's plenty of iron sources out there, and that's in the book Eating Up the World as well. It's all outlined in there. And now, what's interesting is that you can have too much iron, and too much heme iron actually leads to all sorts of problems. High iron intakes or high iron burden increases colorectal cancer, cardiovascular disease, infection, neurodegenerative disorders, inflammatory conditions, and other diseases like Parkinson's, arthritis, etc. And Does excessive iron play a role in breast carcinogenesis? You bet it does. In fact, it's one of the big markers for heme iron. It's a pro-oxidant that causes oxidative stress and damage, and DNA damage contributes to breast carcinogenesis, independently of potentiating the effects of ethanol and iron iodizing radiation. And iron plays an important role in creating oxidative tissue damage and carcinogenesis. People with higher serum iron or copper concentrations have got higher risk of dying of cancer, and higher risk of ovarian cancer, endometriosis, and a 92.9 times greater risk for a particular type of carcinoma, which is extraordinary. An iron deficiency can cause anemia, but when you have a plant-based diet and you have a lot of greens, you don't have anemia. You have plenty of iron. In meat-eating countries, iron excess is more of a problem than iron deficiency. And body iron stores accumulate too much. And when a doctor says, oh, you've got good iron levels in your liver, no, the liver is where the body stores poisons. You want to avoid that. You want to avoid having too much heme iron. You want non-heme iron that the body converts to heme iron as is required. And the data suggests that ambient levels of iron stores may be noxious and can constitute a public problem that affects large segments of the population. And you can see that most of the population is adversely affected. And cancers are way lower in vegetarians than among meat eaters, and heme iron is one of those factors. And so heme iron intake it leads to higher diabetes, higher cancers, and all these problems. And so that is basically the presentation there.